And tonight we're talking about the idea of nature. Now, there is so much to say about nature. I want to focus on a particular kind of idea and that we find going through history that in some ways ties together all of these lectures that we've been talking about, these ideas of goodness and love and justice and beauty. We find all of these ideas represented in the works of Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold, of course, is a fairly local person who taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for many years, had a shack that with land that he and his family restored near Baraboo. And he's famous for being the advisor on the Coon Creek watershed project in Coon Valley, which was the nation's first watershed restoration project. It's famous all over the world. And yet a lot of people right here don't realize how famous Coon Valley is. So I want to start with this idea of the Book of Nature and then come back to Leopold and then talk about the way Leopold kind of combines all of these ideas we've been talking about over the weeks. And I want to start it out by talking about how I first became acquainted with this idea of reading nature like a book. And it was when I was about 12 years old, walking in the woods with my Uncle Bob, and he had taken me grouse hunting. And we're walking through the woods, and he keeps pointing out things, and he'll point at us. See that porcupine over there? And you say, oh, like there's a grouse right there, and I can't see a thing. I'm looking around, he's pointing at all these things. And I'm thinking, like, how does he see that? It wasn't just like how does he know what to look? How does he know what to look for? He's walking through a very different landscape than I'm walking through. That became really obvious. And it was years before I learned how to walk through the woods and start to see things the way somebody like that did, who had a lot of experience in what to look for. He was walking through and he was reading the landscape. About 10 years ago, I took a duck hunting trip to North Dakota with Mark Schultz, who was a former La Crosse County Conservation Extension agent, and he kept up a running commentary the entire way drive from La Crosse out to central North Dakota on what we were seeing in the landscape. And he's talking about the potholes and he's talking about landscapes where wetlands have been drained, and we're driving through a lot of this area in western Minnesota where I grew up, and I just always took this landscape for granted, like this is the way the landscape has always been. And he's just pointing out like how these trees that are not native and where fields have been drained, where there used to be wetlands, and one thing after another. And I realized like I'd lived there for much of my life and didn't know what I was looking at. And this is what it's like to be in the company of somebody who can read the land and see the meaning of the appearances. We're both seeing the appearances, but we're not seeing the same meaning, not seeing the same significance. The idea of nature as a book comes from Augustine, and it appears for the first time in one of his sermons. And he says, "There is a great book, the very appearance of created things. Look above you, look below you, note it, read it." And from that time on, this idea of the book of nature gains currency, and it was an extraordinarily popular view throughout the Middle Ages. The idea was that nature itself testifies to God's glory. And we can know about God through Scripture. This is the way in which God's nature is revealed, but we can also know about God through nature if we learn to read it correctly, because everything bears signs of its creator. So it's a very theological view, but it's also a view that's very reverential towards nature. It's at this time also that the idea of Jesus as a gardener becomes very popular. Jesus as the second Adam, Adam as a gardener. The name Adam means earth. And so Adam, who's the story is created from the dust of the earth, has a name that means earth. Adamah is a word for earth. And then Jesus, as the second Adam, comes to be a caretaker. And so, for example, there's paintings by Rembrandt with Jesus standing outside of the tomb wearing a Dutch gardening hat and a trowel in his belt. This was very popular during the Renaissance, especially to portray biblical scenes in contemporary fashion. And so you have Rembrandt painting Jesus after the resurrection as a gardener. Now, why in the world would that be? Well, because he came to redeem all of creation, right? This is the theological significance of this. So this idea of nature as a book becomes really significant after the time of Augustine, throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And then it starts to acquire a different meaning with the coming of the scientific revolution. Because then we get like, well, how do we read nature? Well, that means investigating, like, what are all the particular causes of one thing after another? Not so much why does it exist, but how do things happen? As if it's all mechanism. And so you get a lot of talk about like nature being like a clock, and a very kind of mechanistic view. But then we get Leopold kind of restoring in some way this idea of reading nature, but reading it with love, and reintroducing the idea of love as central to the way in which we come to understand nature's significance. Now, I want to take a little detour here to think about the very idea of reading and what it means. And this comes from another thinker, the one we were talking about last time, Simone Weil, who we were focusing on her views of justice. Simone Weil had a little-known essay called An Essay on the Notion of Reading, where she just talks about, like, what is reading? And she says, like, reading is not interpreting. It's not looking at the appearance of things and interpreting. The phenomenon of reading, if we pay attention to what happens to us, is meaning comes into us directly from appearances of things. And that is why when you look at a word that you cannot read, the meaning does not come across. So here's a word, and what do you see? Well, what you do is you start paying attention, well, like the certain characteristics of it, like, well, there's a line all the way across, and then it's got these shapes, and we start paying attention to all these details, but there's no meaning there. The word, by the way, it's Sanskrit, it's sarala, which means a pine. Now, if I give you this, right? Now, try looking at this without noticing its meaning. And you can't do it because you don't look at the appearance of the thing and then interpret what its meaning is. When you know how to read something, the meaning just comes right to you. You glance at this. Now, if we weren't going to do anything more and then I was going to ask you, say, 10 minutes later, tell me something about the font that the word pine was in. Is it Times New Roman or is it Garamond? And And you would have no idea because you wouldn't have noticed that. But if I'd asked you what was the word, say pine, because it has a meaning for you. But of course, it's not Times New Roman or Garamond or anything else. It's Aptos, which is the most nondescript kind of typeface. Meanings come directly. So Simone Weil talks about, like, we read meanings and appearances all the time. And this is why there's a phenomenon that you might have experienced where you're walking down the street in a dark night and you think there's somebody up ahead who might be threatening. And you kind of stiffen up, like you have an instant reaction. And you take a few steps further along and you realize, oh, it's not a person at all, it's a bush. And then when you look at it again, you think, and it doesn't look anything like a person. But I was convinced for a moment it was a person. Or like you're walking down the sidewalk, say in La Crosse, and you'll say hi to somebody and with their name because they're a little distance off, and they give you a puzzled expression, and you look and you realize it's not that person at all. And you think, like, I was convinced it was that person, and now I look at them again, and it's obviously not. Like, how can their appearance change that quickly? Well, it isn't that their appearance changed. The meaning comes directly to you, right? So this happens to us over and over. Well, this is what is going on, say, when I'm walking with Bob through the woods. I'm looking at everything as if it's Sanskrit, where I'm looking at the details of all these features, but no significance is coming out. But he's looking, there's all these meanings coming out. And so he's just glancing and he's seeing this and this and this, right? Cal DeWitt, who taught ecological science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for many years. In fact, he held the chair that Leopold used to hold. Told a story one time about having a class with some of his students where they were learning about native prairie grasses. And if you drive ditches on drive certain roads in Wisconsin, you'll see a lot of these native plants growing in the ditches. In fact, that is how Leopold restored the prairies at the Arboretum and at the shack. So he would take his car and he would dig up chunks of sod out of the ditches and load it in the back of his truck and bring it back to the shack and plant it. And that's how they restored a native prairie. So Cal DeWitt is talking about, like, for like one weekend, he had a student who had driven home to northern Wisconsin, and she'd come back on Monday, and he asked her, like, well, how was your weekend? And she said, well, it was fine, but I almost drove off the road. I was driving along, noticing all these plants in the ditch, and now she knew the name of them. But before, like, she'd driven that road many times and always been just weeds. Right? Because the meaning hadn't come. She didn't know how to read it. Now she could read it. She was fascinated with it, and her attention was drawn. So this idea of reading can be quite significant. It changes what we see. Simone Weil says that justice consists in reading people in a certain way so that the meaning of them as being made in the image of God, of being a presence that we owe something to, comes directly to us. This is what justice is. We were talking about justice as being in right relationship with others, and being in that kind of relationship depends on a certain kind of reading. Leopold also takes this notion of reading, that is justice towards the land requires us to be in a certain kind of relationship. He talks over and over about being in harmony with the land. But being in harmony comes from a certain kind of reading, from the ability to see the significance of the things that we're looking at. he wants to be very insistent that like our policies matter a great deal. And we argue about these politically quite a bit, but the failure of our relationship to land isn't just a failure of policies, it's this failure of understanding. It's a failure of knowing how to perceive, how to see the significance of what we're looking at. And to develop that, we have to spend time in the presence of the natural world. So Leopold, born in Burlington, Iowa, I put some of this on the handout there. Born in Burlington, Iowa, he goes to the Yale Forestry School. He ends up graduating from there, getting a job in the Arizona and New Mexico territories, begins doing all kinds of work on his own, extra work that he's not really required to do, but coming up with game management plans, developing clubs, writing all kinds of tracts, treatises on land restoration. He gets invited to come to the University of Wisconsin that wants to develop the Arboretum and restore the prairie. As part of that, he gets a teaching position at the University of Wisconsin Management as Wisconsin as a professor of game management. This is an entirely new position that hadn't existed before, so he has to figure out what he wants to do with it. And he turns it into more than that. Really what I think they had in mind was they wanted somebody who can teach how do we manage the deer herd. And he wants to do more than that. He wants to develop a program in which we learn, like, how do we develop this relationship with the land so that we know how to restore it. Because we can't restore it if we don't understand it. And we can't understand it if we aren't in relationship to it. And so he's working on essays this whole time, really from the early 1930s on until 1948, when he finally gets a publisher for a Sand County Almanac. He had titled it Great Possessions. That's what he was calling this collection of essays. Oxford University Press, which was the press that had accepted the manuscript. He had a lot of rejections, by the way, before they accepted it. They didn't like the title Great Possessions. They thought it was too similar to Dickens' Great Expectations. But he'd had it accepted. It was in the review process when a fire broke out on a neighbor's property, a neighbor to this shack, this land in Baraboo. He was fighting the forest fire, or the grass fire, and he didn't come back. And some people went out looking for him and found out he had had a heart attack fighting this fire. And so the Sand County Almanac was published posthumously. It was published just a few months after he had passed away. And the press changed the name to a Sand County Almanac. That title comes from the first part of the book. The essays are arranged by month. And so as you read them, they take you through the course of the year. And the observations come from all over Wisconsin, but a lot of them are from the shack property, that area near Baraboo. By the way, you can go visit the shack. You can, and you can look this up. The Leopold Center is open. They do very nice tours there, and you can learn more about Leopold, and you can visit the shack property, which I would highly recommend. So just outside of Baraboo. He diagnoses our situation in this way, talking about contemporary people like us. Says, the average person is separated from the land by many middlemen, by innumerable gadgets. He has no vital relation to it. To him, it is the space between cities on which crops grow. turn him loose for a day on the land, and if the spot does not happen to be a golf links or a scenic area, he is bored stiff. And that is pretty much the condition that most people feel towards nature, because when we drive, like going from one place to another place, we see mostly empty country. And it's especially empty when we don't stop and inhabit it for a while. One of the quotes I gave you on the handout comes from Henry David Thoreau, when he'd only sit in quietly in a spot for long enough, and all the creatures of the woods will reveal themselves to you in turn. And this is absolutely true. You spend some time quietly in just about any wild place, or even in city places like this at night when nobody else is about, and you will see all kinds of wild creatures that come out. You'll find in the middle of the cross foxes and coyotes, and a barred owl, which was just behind our house the other day. We're right in the middle of the city, and so they're barred owl, probably eating squirrels, which is fine. There's way too many of them. So how does this work? How do we develop this understanding? Well, he says, learning to understand is a matter of reading the land, and this begins, he says, as in art with the pretty, and extends through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. So we begin with what's attractive to us for some reason, and then we get curious about it, we spend more time with it, and then we investigate it, and we learn more about it. So how does that work? Well, let's say that you are outside and you hear some songs of birds and you think, well, I like these bird songs. Well, then you go like, so what birds are they? Which birds are singing the songs that I like? And then you start paying more attention. And once you learn what songs go with which birds, then you begin to notice things like, well, why do I hear some songs in the spring and I hear other songs in the fall? Why do I hear some songs at evening and others in the morning? And you start noticing those sorts of things. And we notice more and more as we go along. A Sand County Almanac is kind of like an instruction manual for how to read the land. And he does this by taking us through month by month and just telling stories about what he's seeing. And because he's such a fascinating writer, it's like we're right there with him. So here we are on December 1st. And so I'm going to share with you just a couple passages from December. And he says this: "Our woods always harbors grouse, but one day last winter, after a deep and soft snow, I could find neither a grouse nor a track of one. I had about concluded that my birds had moved out, when my dog came to point in the leafy top of an oak blown down last summer. 3 grouse flushed out one by one. There were no tracks under or near the downed top. Obviously, these birds had flown in, but from where? Grouse must eat, especially in zero weather, so I examined the droppings for a clue." Now, this is just fascinating. Like, most people are fine just to flush some grouse, and they've seen them, and that, oh, grouse must hanging out there. He's wondering, like, why are they hanging out here, right? And then he starts looking for tracks in the snow and doesn't see them, and then he starts looking for droppings. "Among much unrecognizable debris, I found bud scales and also the tough yellow skins of frozen nightshade berries. In a thicket of a young soft maple I had noticed in summer an abundant growth of nightshade. I went there, and after a search, found grouse tracks on a log. The birds had not waded the soft snow, they had walked the logs and picked the berries projecting here and there within their reach. This was a quarter-mile east of the downed oak. That evening at sunset, I saw a grouse budding in a popple thicket a quarter-mile west. There were no tracks. This completed the story. These birds, for the duration of the soft snow, were covering their home range a wing, not a foot, and the range was half a mile across. So just this patient investigation and curiosity of what's going on. Then he says this, science knows little about home range, how big it is at various seasons, what food and cover it must include, when and how it is defended against trespass, and whether ownership is an individual, family, or group affair. These are the fundamentals of animal economics or ecology. Every farm is a textbook on animal ecology. Woodsmanship is the translation of the book. And so here is Leopold. He's just giving us a instruction. This is how we read the book of nature. We start asking questions and we learn it just like when we learn to read words as a child, one word at a time, one after another, and pretty soon we're putting it together and the meanings just come right to us. So then we end up walking through the landscape and we're just seeing all the meanings here and there. Well, I want to give you a final word from Aldo Leopold. And he says this, we shall never achieve harmony with the land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive. And I think that's true of all the ways that we search for our meaning in our lives. We never find absolute meaning. We never find the final answers that we're looking for. But we continue to strive. And as we strive, we keep learning. We keep finding things of significance. And the more we strive, the more little meanings come across to us here and there and directly from the appearances of things around us. So thank you very much. That concludes this lecture in the lecture series. I put some questions about nature onto your handout. So take about 15 minutes and talk at your tables. If you're at one of these tables with just one person, I'd ask you just to join some others so you don't have to have a narrow-minded conversation.